Have you ever driven down a lonely road at night, when the world outside your headlights feels like it doesn't belong to this one? The silence, the shadows, the sense that something, or someone, is watching you. Many travelers have shared stories of strange figures, ghostly hitchhikers, and encounters that can't be explained. Tonight, we dive deep into the unnerving encounters people face on dark roads when the night itself seems alive and waiting. The long stretch of asphalt shimmered under the pale glow of the moon as Daniel adjusted his grip on the steering wheel, trying to fight off the drowsiness creeping into his mind. It was past midnight, and the road stretched endlessly in front of him, cutting through a landscape of desolate fields and dense woods. He had taken this route countless times during the day, but at night it felt transformed, as if the very air carried a strange heaviness that made the silence unsettling. His headlights carved a narrow tunnel of light ahead, beyond which everything was swallowed by darkness, making him feel like he was driving through some isolated void. The faint hum of the engine and the occasional rattle of loose gravel were the only sounds, creating an uneasy rhythm that seemed to amplify the loneliness of the journey. Every mile marker he passed reminded him of how alone he truly was on this stretch of highway. The occasional gust of wind shook the trees lining the road, their shadows stretching unnaturally across the pavement like long, grasping fingers. He found himself glancing into the rearview mirror more often than he needed to, a part of him expecting to see something other than the empty road behind. His mind drifted toward the strange stories he had heard growing up. Tales of travelers seeing figures on the roadside, phantom cars appearing and disappearing, whispers that seemed to ride the wind. He laughed at himself softly, trying to brush away the unease, but the feeling that he wasn't entirely alone pressed deeper into him. The fuel gauge hovered just above half, and Daniel reminded himself there was no reason to stop until he reached the next town. Still, he found his eyes scanning the roadside for signs of life: an open diner, a gas station, anything that would remind him that the world hadn't completely vanished. Instead, there was only darkness and the occasional glimmer of animal eyes reflecting back from the trees. At one point he thought he saw movement just beyond the reach of his headlights, a flicker of a silhouette that disappeared as quickly as it came. His stomach tightened, and he shook his head, blaming fatigue and the tricks of shadow. The minutes dragged on with an unnerving weight, and Daniel began to realize how oppressive silence could become when stretched across endless miles. The road felt too quiet, as if the world outside his car had been drained of all sound. Not even crickets or the call of night birds broke through the air, leaving him with the constant hum of his tires and the whisper of his own breath. His hands were tight on the wheel now, his body tense, as if he were bracing for something unseen to emerge from the dark. Every so often he glanced at the dashboard clock, watching the numbers crawl forward while the night refused to loosen its grip. The more he drove, the more he felt the road was pulling him somewhere unfamiliar. Despite knowing it was the same highway he had taken many times before, the road ahead remained quiet, but Daniel's attention snapped into sharp focus when he spotted a lone figure standing on the shoulder just beyond the curve. At first, he thought it was a trick of the shadows, but as his headlights illuminated the area, he could see the outline of a person clearly, motionless and facing the road. A chill ran through him at the thought of someone out here at this hour, miles from the nearest town, with nothing but trees and fields surrounding them. The figure didn't wave, didn't move, didn't seem to acknowledge the approaching car, and that stillness made Daniel's pulse quicken. His instincts wavered between slowing down to see if the stranger needed help and pressing harder on the accelerator to leave the eerie sight behind him. As the distance between them closed, he began to make out faint details. The person appeared to be wearing a long coat that hung heavily around their legs, the fabric shifting slightly in the breeze. Their face, however, remained hidden, shadowed by the tilt of their head and the glare of the headlights. Daniel's throat went dry as he realized the figure wasn't standing near a parked car or with any visible belongings. Just there, planted on the roadside as if waiting. He eased his foot off the gas, the car slowing as he drew nearer, curiosity and unease twisting together in his chest. His window was closed, yet he swore he felt a sudden drop in the temperature, the kind of cold that crept under his skin. The moment his car reached parallel with the stranger, Daniel turned his head slightly, expecting eye contact or at least some acknowledgement. Instead, he was met with the unnerving sight of a completely expressionless face, pale and almost wax, like with eyes that seemed too dark to reflect the light. The figure remained still, not reacting in the slightest to the sound of the car passing or the beams of light flooding over them. A sharp shiver surged through Daniel's spine, and without thinking, he pressed harder on the accelerator, desperate to put distance between himself and that unnerving presence. In the mirror, he could still see the figure, standing exactly where he had left them, watching the road as though nothing had changed. He expected the shape to fade away as he sped farther, but even after several moments, it remained visible, an unmoving silhouette clinging to the edge of the darkness. His breathing grew uneven as he forced his eyes back to the road, refusing to keep looking behind him, convinced that if he stared too long, he might see the figure begin to move. The silence inside the car grew heavier, his heart pounding so hard it drowned out the hum of the engine. He tightened his grip on the wheel, trying to shake the image from his mind, but the unsettling truth lingered. Someone, or something, was out there on that empty highway, and its presence felt like more than coincidence. The road stretched endlessly ahead, the faded lines guiding Daniel forward through the suffocating darkness. But his thoughts kept circling back to the figure he had passed moments earlier. No matter how much he tried to convince himself it was just a traveler, perhaps someone stranded or lost, the image of that pale, blank face lingered, seared into his mind like a brand. He rolled down his window slightly, hoping the cool night air would ground him, but instead it carried only emptiness, an unsettling stillness that made him feel even more exposed. He forced his attention forward, trying to ignore the gnawing unease growing inside him, until something new caught his eye, a faint pair of headlights appearing in the rearview mirror. At first, the sight brought relief. The presence of another vehicle meant he wasn't alone out here anymore, and the idea of someone else sharing the stretch of highway gave him comfort. Yet as the moments passed, that comfort began to waver. The lights weren't closing the distance as they should have, nor were they falling behind. They simply hovered at the same spot, glowing faintly in the mirror as though fixed in place. Daniel frowned, glancing back more often than he intended, trying to make out what kind of car it was. The distance was too great to identify any details, but the glow of the headlights remained constant, unwavering in intensity, as if they weren't attached to anything real. Minutes passed, and the situation only grew stranger. Every time the road bent or dipped, he expected the lights to vanish briefly, blocked by the curve of the earth, but they never did. They remained locked in his mirror, as if tethered to his car no matter how the highway twisted or turned. His pulse quickened as he pressed down on the accelerator, pushing his car faster to test whether the lights would respond. To his unease, they matched his speed effortlessly, maintaining that same impossible distance. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool air rushing through the cracked window. His knuckles pale against the steering wheel as his grip tightened. The longer it went on, the more unnatural it felt. Every so often he thought he saw the lights flicker faintly, not like real headlights, but like lanterns struggling against the dark, as if their glow belonged to something older than any car. He considered pulling over to the side of the road, letting whatever it was pass him, but the thought of stopping out here with that presence approaching made his stomach twist. Instead, he kept driving, trying to focus on the stretch of asphalt ahead, though his eyes couldn't resist darting back to the mirror every few seconds. Then, as abruptly as they had appeared, the lights seemed to swell brighter, closer, filling the mirror as though they were about to overtake him. His breath caught, his entire body tensing in anticipation, but just as the moment reached its peak, the glow blinked out entirely, leaving nothing but the empty road stretching into darkness. Behind him, Daniel's nerves were frayed after the disappearance of the headlights, and he tried to steady his breathing as the silence of the night closed in again. He told himself he was tired, that exhaustion was making his imagination run wild, but no amount of logic could erase the chill that had settled deep in his chest. He gripped the wheel tighter and forced himself to keep moving forward, his headlights illuminating the ribbon of asphalt that seemed to stretch endlessly through the black void of night. It was then that he saw something further ahead, standing near the shoulder of the road. At first, he thought it might be another person like before, but this time the figure shifted as though waiting for him. And Daniel's heart skipped a beat when he realized it was a hitchhiker. The man raised an arm slowly, his thumb jutting out in the universal gesture for a ride, though his movements seemed oddly stiff, as if rehearsed. Daniel's instincts screamed at him not to stop, but as he drew closer, he noticed details that made him doubt what he was seeing. The hitchhiker looked strangely out of place. His clothes were outdated. the kind of style Daniel remembered seeing in old photographs, with a worn jacket and trousers that didn't match modern fashion. His hair was slicked back, and his posture seemed frozen, almost too perfect, like a figure pulled from another time. Daniel eased his foot against the gas, deciding to pass him by, but something about the man's expression as he entered the beam of the headlights made his blood run cold. The face was blank, with eyes that seemed dark and hollow, yet fixed directly on him, unwavering. Daniel sped up, refusing to make eye contact again, and within moments the figure disappeared into the darkness behind him. He let out a shaky breath, relief washing over him, until he dared to glance in the rearview mirror. His chest tightened as he saw nothing. No hitchhiker, no fading silhouette, just the empty road. It made no sense. He had just passed him, and yet there was no trace left behind. He shook his head, his thoughts spiraling into disbelief, and tried to convince himself he had imagined the entire encounter. But the lingering sense of unease would not leave, clinging to him like a shadow he couldn't shake. Several miles later, just as he began to settle back into a rhythm, Daniel's stomach dropped. Standing once again at the side of the road was the same hitchhiker, in the exact same stance, thumb out, clothes hanging stiffly, head tilted slightly in his direction. His hands trembled against the steering wheel, and he felt the air grow heavy inside the car. He pressed the accelerator harder, speeding past without daring to slow down. His eyes flicked to the mirror against his better judgment, and again the figure was gone, vanishing the instant he passed. The cycle repeated a third time, the same hollow-eyed hitchhiker appearing farther down the road as if waiting specifically for him, his presence unavoidable, his disappearance just as sudden, leaving Daniel caught in a nightmarish loop with no clear escape. The road finally began to widen as Daniel approached what looked like the faint glow of lights in the distance. Relief washed over him at the thought of civilization, even if it was nothing more than a rundown gas station. He had been driving for what felt like hours through the endless darkness, haunted by the repeating hitchhiker, and the sight of a place where he could stop felt almost like salvation. As his car drew closer, he realized the lights were dim and uneven, some flickering weakly against the night. The station sat in isolation, surrounded by cracked asphalt and weeds pushing through the ground, its faded sign barely legible above the canopy that stretched over two rusted fuel pumps. He slowed the car and pulled in cautiously, his headlights sweeping across the building. The glass windows of the convenience store were clouded with dirt, and the neon OPN sign in the corner buzzed faintly, its glow struggling to remain steady. The place looked abandoned yet stubbornly alive, as if it had been left to decay but never truly died. Daniel parked by one of the pumps and shut off the engine, the sudden silence filling the space with a suffocating weight. He sat for a moment, unsure if he should even get out, but his need for reassurance, for some sign of normality, pushed him to open the door. The night air bit at his skin, colder here than it had been on the open road. As he walked toward the store, the sound of his shoes crunching on the gravel seemed unnaturally loud. He glanced at the pumps, their screens dark and lifeless, the hoses hanging limply as though they hadn't been touched in years. A faint hum came from inside the building, like an old refrigerator running endlessly, and Daniel hesitated before reaching for the door handle. The glass door gave way with a squeak, and a faint bell jingled above him, though the sound was distorted, like it came from a broken recording. Inside, the air smelled of dust and oil, and the shelves were sparsely stocked with items that looked old, their labels faded, some coated with a thin layer of grime. Daniel called out softly, hoping for an attendant, but no one answered. His voice echoed faintly in the empty room, unsettling in its hollowness. The counter stood at the far end, a cash register perched on top, and for a moment he thought he saw movement behind it. He froze, his breath catching, but when he focused, there was nothing there, just shadows pooling in the corners. He stepped forward cautiously, the fluorescent light above him flickering as though in protest. The farther he moved into the store, the heavier the air felt, and a strange awareness crept over him, as if unseen eyes were tracking his every step. The bell at the entrance suddenly jingled again, though the door hadn't moved, and Daniel spun around, his pulse thundering in his ears. The glass reflected only his car sitting outside, yet the sensation of not being alone pressed harder against him, making the empty store feel like a trap tightening around him. With each passing second, Daniel hurried back to his car, his nerves frayed from the unnatural silence inside the gas station, and started the engine with trembling hands. The growl of the motor gave him a fleeting sense of relief, as if the mechanical sound alone could push back whatever strange presence seemed to be following him. He pulled out onto the empty highway once more, eager to leave the station behind, but the air in the car felt heavy and close, the kind of weight that made every breath come shallow and uneven. To distract himself, he reached for the old CB radio mounted beneath the dashboard, a device he rarely used but kept for emergencies. Static filled the cabin immediately, its harsh crackle oddly comforting compared to the suffocating silence. He adjusted the dial, hoping for a voice, a trucker, anyone who might share this road and remind him that he wasn't completely alone out here. At first there was nothing but static, endless and hollow, and then faintly, so faint he thought he imagined it, came the sound of words. They were distorted, buried under the hiss, but there was no mistaking the cadence of speech. Daniel leaned closer, gripping the receiver, straining to make out the voice. It was low, gravelly, like someone whispering directly into his ear despite the distance. The words were jumbled at first, phrases cut off, until one came through with eerie clarity. "You shouldn't be here." His blood ran cold. He froze, the radio pressed to his hand, listening as the static rose again. Another phrase broke through, clear this time. "He's watching." Daniel felt every muscle in his body tighten, his eyes darting to the mirrors instinctively, searching for headlights, for any sign of life on the road. There was nothing but the endless stretch of black asphalt behind him. His voice shook as he pressed the button on the receiver and tried to speak. "Who is this?" he asked, his words quick and uneven. The radio hissed, cracked, and for a long moment there was no answer. Then, cutting sharply through the static, came a sound that made his chest seize. The faint echo of laughter, dry and hollow, like someone enjoying a private joke at his expense. He slammed the receiver back into place, his pulse hammering, but the static continued to spill from the speaker even without him touching it. The laughter was gone, replaced once more by broken fragments of sentences, as though dozens of voices were trying to bleed through at once. Some were sharp and urgent, others slow and almost melodic, but none of them made sense. Daniel gritted his teeth, desperate to drown it out, but the more he turned the dial, the clearer the voices became, as if they were following his every move. He shut the radio off completely, the sudden silence leaving his ears ringing. But even without the device, he thought he could still hear faint whispers, not from the speaker, but from the darkness pressing in on the car itself. The sensation of being surrounded closed in harder than ever, and he gripped the wheel until his fingers ached, praying for the night to release him from its grasp. The highway stretched endlessly ahead, winding into a thicker darkness than before, and Daniel's sense of direction began to unravel. The map in his mind no longer matched the road under his wheels. He tried to convince himself that he was just exhausted, that maybe he had taken a wrong turn without noticing, but the thought refused to settle. The air outside was different too, heavier, colder, and carrying with it a dampness that seeped through the car's thin metal walls. He pressed the gas a little harder, hoping the next landmark or sign would snap everything back into normalcy, but the landscape around him didn't feel like it belonged anywhere he knew. Up ahead, a bridge appeared, rising out of the darkness like the spine of some sleeping creature. Its shape was long and narrow, its sides lined with rusted metal railings that looked as though they hadn't been touched in years. The headlights cut through the mist curling around it, revealing the first stretches of cracked pavement that led across. Relief fluttered in his chest at the sight, because a bridge meant progress, a passage to the other side of whatever wilderness he had stumbled into. He guided the car onto it, the tires thudding softly against the worn surface, and felt the structure shudder beneath him, as though it disliked the intrusion. As the bridge stretched on, he realized it was far longer than it had appeared from a distance. The far end seemed to recede with every passing moment, the faint suggestion of land on the other side dissolving into more fog and shadow. Daniel tightened his grip on the wheel and kept driving, telling himself it was only an illusion caused by the mist and his fraying nerves. But the unease in his gut grew heavier with every second. The sound of the tires against the surface began to echo strangely, like the hollow rhythm of footsteps in an empty hallway. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours, and the end of the bridge never came closer. Each glance in the rearview showed only the same stretch of railings, and mist curling endlessly behind him, as though he hadn't moved forward at all. He tapped his fingers against the steering wheel nervously, the thought creeping into his mind that maybe he wasn't moving at all, that the bridge itself was holding him in place. He pushed the accelerator down, the engine groaning in protest as the car surged faster, but still the horizon ahead remained the same, a gray fog swallowing the faint outline of rails and pavement that continued forever. His chest tightened with panic as he considered stopping, but the idea of halting here, suspended above unseen waters, felt unbearable. He tried the horn, its blare cutting into the fog, only to return to him seconds later, warped and stretched like something alive was mocking the sound. He swallowed hard, his throat dry, and leaned closer to the windshield, as if sheer determination could force the other side to appear. The bridge stretched on, indifferent to his fear, carrying him deeper into a place that no longer felt bound by ordinary rules of distance or time. Daniel had no way of knowing how long he had been on the bridge before the fog began to change. At first it clung low and thick around the tires, rolling lazily like smoke, but then it grew denser, swallowing the headlights and smearing the world into a pale blur. The metal rails of the bridge vanished from sight, leaving him with the unnerving sensation of floating through nothing. He leaned forward, squinting into the haze, desperate for any landmark that might assure him he was still on solid ground. The engine hummed beneath him, steady and real, but everything beyond the hood of the car had become a shifting wall of white. It was in that silence, broken only by the soft hum of the motor, that he noticed the shapes. At first they seemed like tricks of the mist, wisps forming vaguely human outlines before dissolving. He rubbed his eyes, telling himself fatigue was playing games with him, but the forms grew clearer the farther he drove. Figures stood just beyond the edge of visibility, half concealed by the fog, their silhouettes tall and unmoving. He gripped the wheel tighter, his skin prickling as he realized they were lining both sides of the road, silent watchers carved out of vapor and shadow. None of them moved, yet their presence pressed against him like a physical weight. He refused to slow down, but his heart hammered with the certainty that they were not illusions. Every few seconds, when the fog thinned slightly, he caught glimpses of more detail. The curve of a head, the slope of shoulders, the suggestion of faces that never fully came into focus. They seemed to lean toward the road, as though studying him, and the deeper he drove, the more numerous they became. It was like traveling through a corridor of statues, except the statues breathed. Then one of them shifted, barely but unmistakably. A pale arm, long and unnatural, stretched just enough to brush the edge of the light. Daniel's breath caught in his throat, and instinctively he pressed the accelerator harder. The car jerked forward, the engine roaring against the still air, but the figures did not fall away behind him. Instead, they appeared to glide with him, keeping pace on both sides. Some grew sharper in the beams of his headlights, revealing hollow sockets where eyes should have been, their empty stares fixed on him without blinking. He forced himself to stare ahead, but the temptation to look was overwhelming, every flicker of motion clawing at the corners of his vision. A sudden thud rattled the roof of the car, followed by the unmistakable scrape of something dragging across the metal. Daniel ducked instinctively, his knuckles white against the wheel, but he didn't dare stop. The sound faded, replaced once again by the whisper of fog curling against the glass. But now every nerve in his body screamed at him that the figures had closed in tighter. The mist pressed against the windows like hands reaching for him, and no matter how fast he went, the shapes stayed with him, silent and unrelenting, as though the night itself had taken form and chosen him as its passenger. Daniel's chest felt tight, his breath shallow as he pushed the car faster through the suffocating fog. But at last the shapes faded, dissolving back into the mist as if they had never been there. His relief was short-lived when the fog began to thin, not into open road, but into a darkness even more complete than before. The bridge was gone, and the car rolled onto an unfamiliar stretch of narrow road, lined with skeletal trees that clawed at the night sky. Their bare branches arched overhead like ribs, enclosing the path in a tunnel that seemed to grow tighter the farther he drove. The air here was different, still, stale, and carrying a faint stench of decay that seeped in through the vents, making him gag. He turned the high beams on, but the light barely cut more than a few yards ahead. The road twisted in sharp angles, forcing him to slow despite his desperate need to escape. Each curve revealed more of the same suffocating woods, as though the landscape was looping back on itself. The silence pressed in heavier than before, broken only by the hum of the tires, until he realized there was another sound beneath it, a low rhythm, faint at first, like distant drums. He strained to hear, but every time he thought the sound grew clearer, it slipped back into the stillness, teasing him with its presence. His unease deepened when he noticed the trees were no longer spaced evenly. Some leaned too close to the road, their trunks twisted unnaturally, their bark scarred with strange carvings that his headlights barely caught before passing. Symbols, crude and sharp, covered the surfaces. Patterns that made his skin crawl with recognition even though he had never seen them before. The deeper he went, the more frequent they became, until entire clusters of trees seemed to pulse with them, the shapes glinting wetly as if freshly carved. Daniel gripped the wheel tighter, trying to focus on the asphalt, but a flash of movement caught his eye in the mirror. For a heartbeat, he saw headlights behind him, two glaring orbs burning through the dark. His pulse spiked, memories of the impossible lights from earlier flooding back. He pressed harder on the accelerator, forcing the car around a sharp bend, but when he looked again, the road behind him was empty, the trees swaying gently as if mocking his fear. His stomach twisted with the certainty that something was playing with him, letting him believe he had moments of safety only to remind him he was not alone. The drumming returned, louder now, steady and deliberate, echoing through the woods though no source was visible. It vibrated in his chest, quickening to match the frantic pounding of his heart. He turned the wheel too sharply at the next curve, the car skidding slightly before regaining its grip, and for the briefest instant, he thought he saw figures standing between the trees. They did not move or follow, they simply watched, their outlines blending into the bark, their heads tilting as though curious. He tried not to look, tried to keep his eyes on the winding road ahead, but the feeling of their gaze stayed fixed on him, clinging to every inch of shadow that surrounded his path. Daniel's hands ached from gripping the steering wheel so tightly, his knuckles pale in the faint glow of the dashboard. The road twisted endlessly through the trees, each turn sharper and narrower than the last, until suddenly the forest broke apart. He burst into an open stretch, the asphalt leveling into a long, straight path that led into the distance. For the first time in hours, he could see the sky above, yet it was no comfort. It was darker than night should ever be, an oppressive void without stars or moon, as if the heavens themselves had been erased. The relief he felt quickly drained as he realized that this was not a way back to safety, but only another stretch of the nightmare. The drumming from the woods faded, replaced by a low hum that seemed to come from beneath the road itself. It vibrated through the steering column, through his bones, and carried a strange rhythm that felt alive. His headlights picked up movement ahead, and his breath caught when a figure stepped into the lane. It was the same pale hitchhiker he had seen before, standing motionless in the center of the road. Daniel slammed the brakes, tires shrieking against the asphalt, the car skidding until it stopped mere feet away. The figure didn't flinch. It simply raised its head, and in the glow of the beams, Daniel finally saw its face clearly. Its features were smooth, almost human but not quite, skin stretched too tightly, eyes too dark, and a mouth curved into the faintest smile that felt more like a warning than a greeting. Daniel sat frozen, every instinct screaming at him not to move, not to look away. The figure tilted its head, mirroring the same gesture he had seen from the watchers in the woods, and then without a sound, it lifted one long arm and pointed down the road ahead. Daniel's throat was dry, but some deep part of him knew he had no choice. With trembling hands, he shifted the car back into gear and pressed forward, driving slowly past the figure. As he passed, he could feel its gaze burning into him, colder than the fog, sharper than the darkness, as though it was marking him for something yet to come. The road ahead seemed endless, stretching through the void, but then, almost suddenly, it changed. Lights appeared on the horizon, faint and distant, but unmistakably real. Street lamps, glowing warm and yellow, flickered into existence like stars returning to a forgotten sky. The asphalt smoothed, the trees receded, and the hum beneath the car faded into silence. He drove toward the lights with tears welling in his eyes, hardly believing he had escaped, until the shapes of familiar buildings emerged. Gas stations, storefronts, and the outline of a town that looked utterly ordinary. The nightmare was behind him. At least, that was what he told himself. But as Daniel pulled into the town and finally stopped the car, his body trembling with exhaustion, he dared one last glance into the rearview mirror. For an instant, just long enough to freeze his heart, he saw the pale figure sitting in the back seat, its dark eyes fixed on him, its faint smile unchanged. Then the mirror flickered, showing only the empty back seat again, as if nothing had ever been there. Daniel closed his eyes, knowing the road had not let him go. It had only followed him home. Thank you so much for joining me on this unnerving journey through the dark roads of the night. If you enjoyed this story, your support means everything. Like, share, and let me know your thoughts. Until next time, stay safe, and remember some roads are better left untraveled.